Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is the first of a series about climate as a religion. Many religions promote the idea that if you misbehave, lack faith, or ask questions, you will suffer a great hellfire. This is exactly what we see about climate. Every day we hear predictions of tremendous heat in the future and fires. These predictions are made by modern-day prophets who are now academics or people working at research institutions. And we're not permitted to question these predictions. Anyone who dares question them is ostracized and warned of tremendous danger. And most importantly, the key aspect to preventing this danger is sacrifice. Our leaders have always taught us that sacrifice is the key to controlling the climate. Let's look at some of the prophecies of hellfire currently in the newspapers. Can you stand the heat? It keeps getting hotter. Yes, summers in the U.S. really are getting warmer. Record highs. The new normal, Earth is getting hotter. And as the planet gets hotter, some mammals may get smaller. I guess that would explain why mammals in Africa, like elephants and giraffes, are so small. We constantly hear claims that summers are getting hotter and heat waves are getting worse in the U.S. Let's look and see if those claims are accurate. We'll start by looking at this date, May 21st in 1934. It's very cool this year on May 21st, but in 1934 the United States was incredibly hot. There were 100-degree weather in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and even West Virginia was 100 degrees at Martinsburg, West Virginia on May 21st, 1934. Today's forecast for Martinsburg was closer to 60 degrees, about 40 degrees cooler than it was in 1934. And on May 21st, 1934, almost every single state had 90-degree temperatures indicated by these yellow dots. The red dots indicate 100-degree temperatures. Now let's compare May 21st, 1934 with May 21st of last year, which experts said was the hottest year on record. This is the equivalent map for May 21st, 2016. Notice that there was almost no 90-degree weather in the country that day, even in the southern areas of Texas and Arizona. So perhaps May 21st of 2016 was a fluke. What we really need to do to analyze climate is to look at the trends. This is the percent of stations over 90 degrees on May 21st every year going back to 1895. What this graph shows us is that May 21st used to be a lot hotter in the United States. The hottest May 21st was 1934. The second hottest was 1925. The third hottest was 1941. Back in the 30s, about 15% of stations were over 90 degrees in the United States on May 21st. That's gone down to about 5% in recent years. There were big spikes in May 21st heat in the US in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and the 1960s. But generally, the trend over the last 80 years is that May 21st has been getting much cooler in the US, with last year being one of the coolest on record. Now let's look at one specific station on May 21st. If you remember, Martinsburg, West Virginia was 100 degrees on May 21st, 1934. The second hottest year was a year earlier, May 21st, 1933. But generally, May 21st temperatures in Martinsburg has plummeted about 10 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1930s, with the last few years being among the coolest on record. Here are some newspaper articles from May 21st, 1934, discussing the tremendous heat and drought the United States was experiencing. One of the most telling news stories about the heat in May 1934 is that there was a tremendous increase in beer consumption during that month at the expense of hard liquor, and this was right after the end of the Prohibition. Most of the U.S. was very hot on May 21st, 1934, but this year it's quite cool in the U.S. In fact, I rode my bike yesterday up to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where Kevin Trenberth works, who's one of the leading climate alarmists. There was a ton of snow up there. So I'm sure there's some people out there who are thinking that I'm cherry picking by picking May 21st. Perhaps May 21st is just a fluke. So let's look at the temperatures for the entire month of May. This graph shows the average percentage of May days over 90°F at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations. We can see from this graph that the three hottest Mays in the United States were 1934, 1911, and 1962, and that generally the frequency of 90-degree days in the entire month of May has plummeted in the U.S., and that in fact the three most recent years have been among the coldest Mays on record. You might be wondering now, why was 1934 so hot? Well, one of the reasons was that there was an incredible drought across the United States. About 80% of the U.S. was in drought that summer. Much of it was in extreme drought, shown in brown. When the soil is dry, temperatures tend to rise to very extreme levels. So I've shown that I wasn't cherry picking May 21st, but there's probably some people out there who think I'm cherry picking May. Perhaps the trend is different for the rest of the summer. So let's look at the graph of 90-degree days at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations for the entire year. We can see that the frequency of 90-degree days in the U.S. has plummeted over the last 80 years. And in fact, 1934 wasn't the hottest summer, 1936 was. There were big spikes in 90-degree weather in the 1930s and the 1950s, but since about 1960, 90-degree weather has become much less common, and recent years have been unusually cool, near a record low. It's clear at this point that the claims of increasing heat and hellfire moving forward into the future are absurd. It's the exact opposite of the trend. But there's another aspect to the hellfire claim. It's actual fire itself. So let's look at that data. What we see once again in this data from the United States Forest Service is that the total acreage burned in the United States has plummeted since the 1930s. It's down about 80%. And this isn't very surprising because it was much hotter and drier in the 1930s than it is now. If we go back even further to pre-industrial levels of CO2, we see an even larger drop. Historically, fire has been a frequent and major ecological factor in North America. In the conterminous United States during the pre-industrial period, when carbon dioxide was below 300 parts per million, an average of 145 million acres burned annually. Today, only 14 million acres, federal and non-federal, are burned annually by a wildland fire from all ignition. So fires are down 90% since CO2 was at pre-industrial levels. So what I've shown you in this video is that the claims of heat and hellfire, which are coming from the climate prophets, are the exact opposite of what's happening. And that's exactly why we're not allowed to question them. If we ask any questions, then it becomes obvious that these people are lying. It's a religion, not a science. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is part 2 of my series, Climate as a Religion. The first part discussed climate and hellfire, and this part discusses climate and the Great Flood myth. Climate alarmists want you to believe that your survival depends on accepting their vision of reality. Part of this is the Great Flood myth, which the New York Times is currently pushing very hard in a feature story. Looming floods threaten cities. The idea that the New York Times is pushing is that your carbon sins will lead to a great flood. This is, of course, very familiar imagery for us. We were all raised with the story that the great flood covered the earth as a result of man's sins. There's nothing new about this story, though, for the New York Times. In fact, 70 years ago this week, they were pushing the exact same story. Warming Arctic climate melting glaciers faster, raising ocean levels, scientists says. If the Antarctic ice regions and the major Greenland ice cap should be reduced at the same rate as the present melting, oceanic services would rise to catastrophic proportions, he said. Peoples living in lowlands around the shores would be inundated. The Arctic change, the scientist asserted, is so serious that I hope an international agency can be formed to study conditions on a global basis. This is most urgent. He wants us to send scientists money. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and they've provided that for us. This image on top is a recent artist rendition of what New York City will look like after the Great Flood comes. If we look down at the bottom, this is the same story from 1926. Science explains why the earth will be engulfed in a flood worse than Noah's. This is the same story going on for over 90 years. Now let's look at the current version of the New York Times flood myth. The risk is clear. Antarctica's collapse has the potential to inundate coastal cities across the globe. If that ice sheet were to disintegrate, it could raise the level of the sea by more than 160 feet. Wow, that's bad. A potential apocalypse, depending on exactly how fast it happened. Recent research suggests that if society burns all the fossil fuels known to exist, the collapse of the ice sheet will be inevitable. So this is where the religious part comes in. They don't present any evidence that fossil fuels have anything to do with the behavior of Antarctic ice. But that's a matter of faith, that fossil fuels are your sin and they will cause the great flood. The purveyors of this religion don't want you to think of it as religion, though, so they speak in terms which sound a little bit technical and sciencey. Incorporating recent advances in the understanding of how ice sheets might break apart, they found that both West Antarctica and some vulnerable parts of East Antarctica would go into an unstoppable collapse if the Earth continued to warm at a rapid pace. Recent advances is the key word here. Makes it sound very modern and scientific. So let's look specifically at what they're talking about for this particular version of the climate apocalypse. What they're saying is that West Antarctica and the Ross Ice Shelf are retreating, and they're going to collapse very rapidly and cause our coastal cities to drown. This next section of the New York Times story is a dead giveaway to what the author is thinking. I don't think the biblical deluge is just a fairy tale, said Terrence J. Hughes, a retired University of Maine glaciologist living in South Dakota. I think some kind of major flood happened all over the world, and it left an indelible imprint on the collective memory of mankind that got preserved in these stories. Well, that's exactly what this article is all about, is the flood myth. There's nothing new about the idea of a West Antarctic ice sheet collapse. In fact, here's the identical story from 95 years ago. With ice ever forming above and a sea gradually growing warmer below, the process must eventually overbalance. The undermined glaciers disintegrate and the ice cap break up. Mountain after mountain of ice will fall into the sea, be swept northwards by the currents, and melt, thus bringing about, but at a much more rapid rate, the threatened inundation of the land by the rising of the sea to its ancient level. That sounds bad. 40 years ago this month, the story of the West Antarctic ice sheet collapse was also big news. In fact, it was on the cover of the Chicago Tribune on January 9th, 1977. But they had a very different take on it. Dr. Richard Cameron, National Science Foundation Program Manager for Glaciology, said, "We're seeing the West Antarctic ice sheet on its way out. It seems to be doing something completely different than the East ice sheet. It has nothing to do with a warmer climate, just the dynamics of unstable ice." 40 years ago, they had a very clear understanding that this had nothing to do with global warming. In fact, at the time, the New York Times was pushing global cooling. Scientists ask why world climate is changing. Major cooling may be ahead. They were even pushing the idea of an ice sheet moving back into the United States. Sooner or later, a major cooling of the climate is widely considered inevitable. Hints that it may have already begun are evident. The drop in mean temperatures since 1950 in the Northern Hemisphere has been sufficient, for example, to shorten Britain's growing season for crops by 2 weeks. As noted in a recent report of the National Academy of Sciences, the global patterns of food production and population that have evolved are implicitly dependent on the climate of the present century. Everybody understood in 1977 that the Earth had been cooling for the past 30 or 40 years. Here's another article from the New York Times from 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in the Northern Hemisphere. The rhetoric of climate fear-mongering 40 years ago was very similar to what we hear now, but there was one huge difference. They were talking about global cooling instead of global warming. Whether the current rhetoric is cooling or warming, the common thread is spreading fear. And that's what these people do very well. Here's an article from National Geographic. Scientists are watching in horror as ice collapses, and they show some poor penguins trapped on the ice who are going to drown, as are we. So are the Ross Ice Shelf and West Antarctic ice sheet actually retreating, as the New York Times and National Geographic say? Well, yes, they are. In fact, here's an article from 1932 titled "A Warmer World." The Great Ice Barrier, which fronts the Antarctic continent with a wall of ice for 250 miles, the Ross Ice Shelf, has retreated at least 30 miles since it was first seen and surveyed. That was in 1841. So between 1841 and 1932, the Ross Ice Shelf retreated 5 feet per day. And then they go on to say that the process of the Ross Ice Shelf retreating may have been going on for centuries. So why is this suddenly big news at the New York Times, something that's been going on since before the industrial age? It obviously has nothing to do with global warming. As top purveyors of the climate religion, the New York Times wants to blame you. So let's look and see if Antarctica is actually warming. Well, satellites show that it isn't. This is satellite data from Antarctica going back to 1979. It shows that there's been no warming since 1979 right up to the current month. Members of the climate religion are naturally suspicious of satellite temperatures because they don't give the global warming answers that they want to see. So what does the surface temperature record show in Antarctica? Well, in 2004, Gavin Schmidt, NASA's top climate alarmist, said, while most of the Earth warmed rapidly during recent decades, surface temperatures decreased significantly over most of Antarctica. So their top climate alarmist said that Antarctica was cooling for several decades. In 2005, NASA published a map showing the cooling that was going on in Antarctica. Notice these large dark blue areas indicating that Antarctica was cooling very quickly. Almost all of the continent was cooling in the 2005 map. The story of Antarctica cooling wasn't very good for the Antarctica ice sheet collapse story. So in 2009, they simply changed the data and they produced a new map which showed the exact opposite of the 2005 map. It showed the entire continent of Antarctica warming, much of it very rapidly instead of cooling. So perhaps it warmed up a lot between 2005 and 2009. Well, satellites don't show that. They didn't show any warming at all during that period. NASA simply changed the data to match their Antarctic ice sheet collapse story. It's pretty clear that Antarctica is not warming, but is the ice melting? Well, a 2015 study by NASA says that Antarctica is gaining ice. If Antarctica is gaining ice, that means that the Antarctic ice sheet is lowering sea level, not raising it. So we've looked at temperatures in Antarctica and seen that they're not warming. In fact, they're probably cooling. And we've looked at the ice sheet to see that it's gaining ice. So let's look at actual sea level now. Let's look at the tide gauge in Manhattan. Manhattan has sea level records going back to before the Civil War. And what they show us is that sea level at Manhattan has been rising at a steady rate of 2.8 millimeters per year ever since. There's been minor increases and minor decreases, but for the most part it's been very steady at 2.8 millimeters per year. That tells us that humans have had no impact on the rate of sea level rise. Speculations of Antarctic ice collapse don't seem to be very well supported by the temperature record, by the ice record, or the sea level record. But what are scientists predicting? This is from the New York Times article. In their worst case scenario, the sea level could rise by 6 feet by the end of the century. That's a huge increase. In order for sea level to rise that much by the end of the century, there'd have to be a huge increase in the rate, from 10 to 20 times depending on whose estimate you look at. So let's look at that on this graph. This pink line shows the rate which they're predicting. That's more than 10 times faster than what we're seeing now. It would require a huge change in climatic and ice conditions for that to occur. So the temperature data, the glacial ice data, and the sea level data don't support this idea of this great biblical flood, which the New York Times is promoting. But there's one more indicator we can look at, which is sea ice around Antarctica. And what we see is that sea ice has been increasing there since 1979. This is an indicator that the water around Antarctica is getting colder as sea ice is increasing. That doesn't sound like it's going to lead to the collapse of the ice sheet, does it? Now I'm going to summarize what I've discussed in this video. First of all, we've seen that this ice sheet retreat in Antarctica has been going on for centuries. The Ross Ice Shelf retreated 5 feet per day from 1841 to 1932. And 40 years ago, the program manager for glaciology at the National Science Foundation reported that the West Antarctic ice sheet was collapsing. It was on its way out and had nothing to do with a warming climate, just the dynamics of unstable ice. The New York Times reported at that time, 40 years ago, that Earth had been cooling for 30 years and was expected to continue to cool. Satellites show that Antarctica is not warming, and the surface temperature record also showed no warming, at least not until NASA changed the data in 2009. NASA's most recent study shows that Antarctica is gaining ice, indicating that it's causing sea level to fall rather than rise. The New York Times claims that New York is going to drown because of the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, but the tide gauge at New York shows no such thing. It shows a steady rate of sea level rise since the Civil War with no acceleration. And we also see that there would have to be an increase in the rate by a factor of 10 or more in order to get to the claimed rates which these scientists are predicting. And finally, we looked at sea ice around Antarctica, which has been expanding for most of the last 40 years, indicating that the water is getting colder around the Antarctic continent. That doesn't seem to support the idea of an Antarctic ice sheet collapse. None of the data we've looked at provides any indication that humans are affecting the West Antarctic ice sheet. But the people which the climate religion caters to are people who naturally feel guilty or have been trained to feel guilty. And so it's easy for them to accept the idea that whatever's going on is their fault. G.K. Chesterton said, "When people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, it's that they'll believe in anything." This is the target audience of the New York Times. And one more quote from Edmund Burke. "All it takes for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Make no mistake about it, the climate religion is evil. Voltaire said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can also make you commit atrocities." Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled "The Imaginary Global Warming Consensus." Margaret Thatcher understood consensus. This is how she described it. "To me, consensus seems to be the process of abandoning all beliefs, principles, values, and policies. So it is something in which no one believes and to which no one objects." This is what Barack Obama said. 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous. Unlike Margaret Thatcher, Obama used consensus as his primary argument. But there was no basis to Obama's claims. The same year that Obama made that claim, the American Meteorological Society took a survey of its professional members. Meteorologists' views about global warming. Is global warming happening? And if so, what is its cause? Yes, mostly human. All respondents, 52%. Only 52% of respondents agreed with the statement that global warming was mostly caused by humans. Among professional forecasters, only 37% believed that it was mostly human. There was no category of scientists which came anywhere close to the 97% which Barack Obama claimed. And nowhere in this survey or any other survey which I'm aware of were the scientists asked if the global warming was dangerous. Let's look at Obama's claim again. 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous. There's no truth to this statement. Obama was trying to push through a political agenda, and he was abusing science and scientists in order to achieve it. Let's look at a real scientist now. Dr. Bill Gray at Colorado State University was a good friend of mine and a giant among men and a giant among scientists. Bill passed away 3 years ago, and I took this photograph of him at lunch a few weeks before he died. Bill was a very famous climate skeptic. He was also the top tropical meteorologist in the world and the father of hurricane forecasting. He was a huge man physically, morally, and scientifically. Even the most notorious global warming alarmists recognized Bill's achievements. Bill Gray, a towering figure in hurricane science, Bob Henson and Jeff Masters. Famed hurricane researcher William Gray passed away at his home in Fort Collins, Colorado on Saturday, April 16, 2016. His death came just as colleagues were gathering in San Juan, Puerto Rico for the American Meteorological Society's 32nd Conference on Hurricanes and Tropical Meteorology, a meeting that Dr. Gray had attended regularly since the 1960s. Gray's best-known research contribution was his founding of seasonal hurricane prediction techniques, which both emerged from and led to a growing understanding of how phenomena such as El Niño and La Niña influence the likelihood of tropical cyclones. Gray published many dozens of peer-reviewed papers, mainly in tropical meteorology. Late in his career, Gray spoke out passionately against the global consensus on climate change science, as noted in a memorial published by Colorado State University, Gray's professional home for more than 50 years. Note that Jeff Masters runs the Weather Underground website, which is full of global warming propaganda. This is one of Dr. Gray's early papers from the Monthly Weather Review in October 1968. Global View of the Origin of Tropical Disturbances and Storms. This paper became the basis of much of modern tropical meteorology. Dr. Gray received funding for his research every year from NOAA for decades until 1993. In 1993, Al Gore became vice president, and he invited Dr. Gray to a global warming conference he was holding. Dr. Gray told him, "I'm happy to come to your conference, but I'm not a big believer in your theories." After telling this to Al Gore in 1993, Dr. Gray never got another penny out of the government. When Al Gore became vice president, the message went out to climate scientists loud and clear. Either you go along with Gore's theories or you lost funding. Bill was a very strong man of exceptional character. Bill refused to go along with Al Gore's lie, so he self-funded his research and his graduate students for 25 years. But very few scientists have the character, integrity, and means to do what Dr. Gray did. It's understood in climate science that if you go along with the global warming scam, you'll get lots of funding, you'll get conferences in places like Cancun, life will be good for you. If you don't go along with the global warming scam, your funding will get cut off. But it's much worse than that. I spent many hours in Dr. Gray's office at Colorado State University. Bill was an incredibly generous person who would talk to me for hours and hours explaining how meteorology works. But when we left his office and walked down the halls, many of his colleagues would not even make eye contact with him. Dr. Gray's skepticism was a threat to their funding. In 2013, the same year that Barack Obama declared his phony 97% consensus, his Secretary of the Interior sent out a stern warning to climate skeptics. Sally Jewell, I hope there are no climate change deniers in the Department of the Interior. This is a very clear and very illegal threat against dissent. It's reminiscent of the persecution of non-geocentricists by the Vatican in the 16th century. So far we've seen that climate skeptics lose their funding, they get ostracized, and they get threatened with termination. Climate skeptics also get personally attacked with very high-profile lies. Naomi Oreskes of Harvard University created this movie, Merchants of Doubt. I attended the premiere of this movie in Washington, D.C., a couple blocks from the White House, and I was sitting with Michael Mann and Katharine Hayhoe. The movie was 100% innuendo, trying to link climate skeptics with big oil and big tobacco. The movie never presented any evidence supporting these claims. The point of the movie was to smear climate skeptics and cast doubt about their motives and intentions. I'm friends with many of the people who were attacked in this movie and know that the movie was full of misinformation. So now we know that climate skeptics get their funding cut off, they get ostracized, they get threatened with termination, and they get character assassination. Additionally, they get threatened with prosecution. Senator Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, wants to prosecute climate skeptics. This is straight out of the game plan of the 16th century Vatican. Other Democratic congressmen have launched investigations against climate change skeptics. Roger Pilkey Jr. out of the University of Colorado was a target of one of these Democratic congressional witch hunts. A University of Colorado professor is being investigated by a Democratic congressman from Arizona over whether he's received research funding from fossil fuel companies. Both Professor Roger Pilkey Jr. and the University of Colorado administration on Wednesday said that is absolutely not the case. There's little or no money for climate skeptics. I'm one of the best known ones and I received no funding. But there's huge amounts of money for climate alarmists. By the year 2009, there were over $2 billion being poured into climate science research by the government. And as the story of Dr. Gray shows us, if you want to get this money, you have to toe the global warming line. But the intimidation of climate skeptics doesn't stop there. A Google search for my name turns up all sorts of fraudulent websites which are being funded to discredit me. These fake websites appear at the top of a Google search for my name. Someone is spending a lot of money to make this happen. The purpose of these fake websites is to disparage me and of course make it difficult for me to obtain employment. It's another form of financial intimidation for those outside the scope of academia. So climate skeptics get their funding cut off. They get ostracized. They get threatened with prosecution. They get congressional investigations. They get personally attacked. They get fake websites made against them. And they get ridiculed. Barack Obama, who has no background in science, accused climate skeptics of being the Flat Earth Society. Climate skeptics are frequently compared with moon landing deniers, which is amazing considering that the only scientist who have walked on the moon, Harrison Schmitt, is a prominent climate skeptic. In fact, 49 of the top people from the Apollo program sent a letter to the NASA administrator a few years ago asking him to end their climate junk science. Many of the people with the right stuff are climate skeptics. There are Nobel Prize winners who are climate skeptics. Freeman Dyson, who the New York Times described as infinitely smart, is a prominent climate skeptic. Edward Teller, the father of the American hydrogen bomb, was a prominent climate skeptic. More than 30,000 American scientists, including more than 9,000 with PhDs, have signed the Oregon petition stating their skepticism. Climate alarmists have attempted to sabotage this petition by putting a few fake names on it. Their argument is that a half dozen fake names takes precedence over the 30,000 plus very real scientists. Barack Obama, who has no background in science and lies about an imaginary global warming consensus, describes these 30,000 scientists and 9,000 PhDs as being the Flat Earth Society. And the mainstream media are a big part of this scam. They openly brag about how they censor climate skeptics. The press, who are supposed to be bastions of free speech, are actually key perpetrators in the destruction of it. Let's review now how the imaginary global warming consensus is created. Defunding, ostracization, censorship, loss of employment, character attacks, threats, fake news attacks, congressional investigations, ridicule, prosecution. Very few scientists are willing or capable to withstand that sort of barrage. Dr. Bill Gray was a true giant among men. And what is the purpose of this imaginary global warming consensus? The purpose is to get people to turn off their brains. The message is that there's no need for you to think because scientists have already done the thinking for you. In fact, you're not even qualified to think about this topic. The scientific and technological elite have done the thinking for you, and you have to blindly follow them over the cliff. 2 days ago, the governor of Pennsylvania signed an executive order saying climate change is the most critical environmental threat facing the world, and he's going to reduce carbon pollution by 80% by the year 2050. There's never been any credible engineering study saying that these sort of goals are even remotely plausible. During the winter and at night, there just isn't much sunshine. Where's this imaginary energy going to come from? Is the governor going to reopen 3 Mile Island, the nuclear reactor which was shut down after a meltdown in the 1970s? I was working last spring in Philadelphia. It was the coldest and snowiest spring on record there. This was my next door neighbor's house on April 1st of last year. An Obama sign which was half buried in snow. Global warming wasn't keeping anybody warm. Without the fossil fuels, countless people would have frozen and starved to death in the dark. What is the governor of Pennsylvania thinking of? Why aren't there engineers involved in the process of making these engineering decisions about our energy future? Climate academics and politicians have no understanding of what it takes to keep a grid running. We have exactly the wrong people making these decisions. And the governor of Pennsylvania imagines that something he's doing is affecting carbon emissions around the world. If we look at the agreement which Barack Obama actually made with China, we can see that he agreed to let them increase their CO2 emissions until the year 2030. If there really is a climate crisis, why did Obama agree to let them keep increasing their emissions? China is already the world's leader in carbon emissions, much higher than the United States, and their emissions growth is skyrocketing. Meanwhile, U.S. emissions have been declining for a decade thanks to fracking. Natural gas produces less carbon dioxide per BTU than coal does. That's why our emissions are declining. And even though fracking is responsible for the reduction in our carbon emissions, progressives want to shut down fracking. So China's carbon emissions are skyrocketing. China and India have more than 1,000 new coal-fired power plants being built. Meanwhile, our emissions are declining. U.S. CO2 emissions are much lower than China. We do not control the world. Donald Trump has understood exactly what's going on for a long time. He tweeted in 2012, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive." I don't necessarily agree with him that the concept was created by the Chinese, but the effect is exactly what he's saying. The politics of global warming hurt the United States and they help China. Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park, said, "Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It's a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled." But there is no global warming consensus. Only 52% of professional members of the American Meteorological Society believe that global warming is mostly man-made. And they were never asked if they believe that global warming is dangerous. Barack Obama's claim, which is the basis of current Pennsylvania policy, was nothing but a big lie. If our fossil fuel supply got cut off, civilization would collapse in a matter of days. Our heat, light, transportation, communications, and food supply are all completely dependent on fossil fuels. It would be completely insane for us to shut down our energy infrastructure without first proving that we have something legitimate to replace it with. There is no global warming consensus. Skeptics are intimidated into silence. Dr. Gray was a hero and a very rare man, and on his deathbed he asked me to carry on his climate legacy. That's one of the big reasons why I do this. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.